Here's a question that should make you uncomfortable. Why was African spiritual practice criminalized with death penalties while European astrology remained acceptable curiosity? Why were Obeah practitioners executed in Jamaica, hanged in Barbados, whipped and exiled in Trinidad, while European alchemists, herbalists, and folk healers were tolerated or even celebrated? The answer reveals something empire desperately wanted hidden. Spell is not superstition, it's technology. Spell names the African technology of deliberate influence, the disciplined use of word, rhythm, substance, timing, and ritual to alter behavior, state, or outcome under conditions of uncertainty. It's not belief, it's not mysticism, it's method, encoded in forms that could survive suppression, travel without institutions, operate under surveillance. From the outside, it appeared as magic. From the inside, it was discipline. Where the power actually came from. Across African societies, ritual power came from 6 recognized sources. 1. Cosmology. Order, balance, timing, reciprocity, consequence. Spell operated within law, not chaos. Ritual efficacy depended on understanding cosmic structure, when to act, what to invoke, how to restore balance. This wasn't mysticism. This was applied knowledge of pattern, cycle, and consequence. 2. Ancestry. Authority derived from lineage, memory, obligation. Ancestors weren't abstract spirits, but active presences whose authority could be invoked, whose sanctions could be enforced. No ritual held power without proper lineage or social sanction. 3. Ecology. Plant, mineral, water, land knowledge deployed with empirical precision long before modern chemical language existed. What appeared as magic herbs were often pharmacologically active substances whose properties were known, tested, transmitted across generations. 4. Psychological mastery. Control of fear, expectation, morale, cohesion, perception. Power moves where the mind follows. Spell operated on belief, anticipation, social psychology, not because it was fraudulent, but because human behavior responds to framing, ritual, collective expectation. This isn't different from how law, propaganda, or ceremony function in any society. 5. Epistemic mastery. Specialist knowledge so disciplined, patterned, causally accurate that it became illegible to outsiders. A furnace producing superior iron without disclosing ratios looked like sorcery to a competitor. A healer knowing which bark arrests fever looked like mysticism to an outsider. A diviner holding hundreds of verses and applying them to complex situations looked supernatural to systems that mistook memory for randomness. 6. Divination as decision technology. Divination systems functioned as structured optionality, not fortune-telling, but a way to map uncertainty, surface variables, select actions under pressure. Ifa is a prime example. A combinatorial logic system pairing 256 outcomes with verses, and verses with actions, requiring trained recall, interpretive discipline, social accountability. From the outside, the system reads as magic. From within, it is governance. Why black magic exists as a term. Black magic is not an African category. It's a colonial naming strategy. European societies practiced alchemy, astrology, divination, folk magic for centuries, sometimes celebrated, sometimes suppressed as heresy. But when African ritual systems threatened colonial power, They weren't merely criminalized as heresy, they were racialized as evidence of savagery. The linguistic maneuver was precise. African ritual equals demonic, savage, dangerous. European ritual equals knowledge, tradition, acceptable mysticism. Spell exposes this asymmetry. The same activities, divination, herbalism, oath-taking, protective ritual, were treated as legitimate inquiry in Europe and capital crime in Africa and the diaspora. Spell as warfare. Why empire feared it. Spell becomes historically visible at moments of pressure. Evidence. Bois Caiman, Haiti, 1791. Vodou ceremony preceded mass uprising. Obeah laws passed by terrified colonial governments across Caribbean. Ritual protection attributed to Dahomey warriors. Poison networks and oath societies destabilizing plantations. Drum bands imposed because rhythm transmitted strategy and coordination. Colonial records confirm this fear. If spell were harmless, it would not have been. Criminalized with extreme penalties. Death, mutilation, exile. Systematically hunted and suppressed. Demonized in legal codes, religious texts, administrative reports. Outlawed even when other superstitions were tolerated. The fact of criminalization is evidence of efficacy. Spell worked, not necessarily through supernatural means, but through its ability to organize people, sustain morale, coordinate resistance, maintain psychological coherence under terror. Spell across the diaspora. Continuity under rupture. When Africans were forcibly displaced across the Atlantic, spell survived because it was portable, required no objects, buildings, written texts. Embodied, lived in memory, gesture, song, practice. Encrypted, legible to insiders. Opaque to hostile observers. Adaptive, could absorb new materials, languages, contexts without losing coherence. Spell reappeared as Vodou in Haiti, syncretized with Catholicism while retaining African cosmological structure. Hoodoo in the American South, rootwork, conjure, herbal medicine as resistance technology. Obeah in the Caribbean, criminalized precisely because it terrified colonial authorities. Santeria and Candomblé in Latin America, Yoruba Orisha systems preserved under Christian cover. Conjure traditions embedded in folklore, music, healing, community practice. These weren't cultural accidents. They were continuity under rupture. What spell enabled that other systems couldn't? Psychic survival under total domination. Maintaining agency when physical freedom was impossible. Covert coordination, organizing resistance without visible infrastructure. Resistance morale, sustaining hope, dignity, collective purpose across generations. The fact that colonial powers banned spell repeatedly, and that those bans failed, proves its durability and strategic value. Spell today. Still operating. Spell hasn't disappeared. It operates in transformed, adapted, sometimes unrecognized forms. Contemporary manifestations. Policing of Black spirituality. Criminalizing herbs and botanicals. Raids on botanicas. Arrests for drug paraphernalia. Surveillance of African spiritual gatherings. Demonization of Black spiritual leaders. Algorithmic suppression. Shadow banning of African spiritual content on social media. Demonetization of videos, posts discussing African cosmology. Content moderation treating African spirituality as dangerous. Appropriation without attribution. Wellness industry extracting African herbal knowledge without credit. Manifestation, culture, repackaging. African ritual technology as self-help. Yoga, meditation, energy work, profiting from stolen epistemologies. Fear of Black collective belief. Political panic when Black churches or spiritual communities organize. Surveillance of mosques, temples, community spaces. Portrayal of Black spiritual movements as threats. Why understanding spell matters now. Spell explains why African spiritual systems remain targets of suppression, extraction, fear. It reveals that what's dismissed as superstition often contains sophisticated technologies of influence, coordination, resistance that power continues to recognize as threatening, even if it can't admit why. Why this matters for Black people. Spell explains how African people maintained agency under total domination. It wasn't passivity. It wasn't just survival. It was active intervention, altering outcomes, protecting communities, disrupting power, sustaining morale, preserving dignity. Understanding spell restores legitimacy to practices dismissed as superstition. It shows that what enslaved and colonized Africans did was not desperate flailing or primitive belief. It was disciplined application of inherited knowledge under impossible conditions. For Black people today, spell is proof of intellectual sophistication, evidence of strategic resistance, validation of practices that never stopped operating, framework for understanding how influence, protection, transformation work without official sanction. Why this matters for the world. Spell proves African societies had sophisticated technologies of influence that rivaled and often exceeded European systems. What was dismissed as magic was often applied psychology, pharmacology, governance, strategic coordination. Recognizing this challenges who gets credited as rational, scientific, advanced. It forces a reckoning with the fact that dismissal of African knowledge was not intellectual, it was political. For the future. We're entering an era where institutions are failing or becoming authoritarian. Psychological warfare is everywhere. Propaganda, algorithms, memetics. People need technologies of resilience that don't require state sanction. Influence without formal power becomes necessary for survival. Spell is a blueprint for influence without power. It shows how to organize, protect, resist when you have no army, no state, no money, only knowledge, timing, collective will, and disciplined practice. In a world of collapsing institutions, algorithmic control, mass displacement, the technology's spell represents portable knowledge, embodied practice, encrypted coordination, psychological resilience, become urgent again. The core truth. Spell is not superstition. Spell is not fantasy. Spell is applied knowledge, encoded in mythic and ritual form, so it could survive criminalization, ridicule, erasure. Its power lies not in mysticism, but in design, redundancy, embodiment, social enforcement. From the outside, it looked like magic. From the inside, it was method. This distinction is not cosmetic. It's the difference between dismissal and recognition. Spell completes the Bridgeworks by providing the activation mechanism, the layer where knowledge becomes operational, where memory transforms into consequence, where instruction becomes intervention. Without spell, African civilization appears passive. With spell, resistance, survival, and agency become legible. Why applied mythology belongs in spell. The core idea: African mythology wasn't just storytelling, it was operational knowledge, cosmology, law, medicine, governance, and psychology rendered in narrative form so it could be memorized, transmitted, and enacted. Spell is where mythology becomes applied. Fable holds the myth. Griot transmits the myth. Spell activates the myth. Transforms story into ritual. Narrative into consequence. Instruction into intervention. Applied mythology equals mythology put to work. Where it goes. Place it right after where the power came from, and before, when mastery looks like magic. It bridges the theoretical, sources of power, and the practical, how it looked in action. Applied mythology. African mythology was never separate from practice. It was operational knowledge, cosmology, law, medicine, psychology, and governance rendered in narrative form so it could be memorized, transmitted, and enacted under pressure. Spell is where mythology becomes applied. A myth about Ogun does not only explain iron, it governs metallurgy, warfare, oaths, and consequences for treaty violations. A story about Osun is not only about rivers, it encodes water management, fertility knowledge, conflict resolution, and diplomatic protocol. Myths of Anansi teach strategy, negotiation, and survival under asymmetric power. When a diviner invokes Ifa, they are not performing superstition. They are accessing a vast corpus of verses, each tied to historical precedent, ethical principle, and practical guidance. When a ritual marks threshold or transition, it is not theatrical, it enacts cosmological law. In African systems, mythology was not belief. It was method. Spell is the mechanism through which mythic knowledge became action, where stories stopped being told and started being done. This is why spell terrified colonial powers. It proved African knowledge was functional, transmissible, and effective. This work is part of the Bridgeworks, an original civilizational framework developed by Chinenye Egbuna Ikwuemezi within Afrodeities, a restorative and corrective project making pre-colonial African history legible while teaching the same encoded knowledge, cultures, and practices across the diaspora. The goal is to demonstrate the power and sophistication of African civilizational architecture, how knowledge was archived, transmitted, and preserved across time and rupture. Afrodeities exists to prove that African memory systems were not primitive. They were engineered for survival. And they worked.